Bettina. Our next session is actually with Cushman Wakefield and Ashling partners. And just to give you a little context on this is a really incredible and inspiring story. And actually, part of the inspiration that Bettina talked about, we had a discussion yesterday with Brandi Corbello, one of our CAB members, who will be speaking. Basically, Cushman is really aligning their vision around the new skills that are needed for workers in the future and figuring out what jobs can be automated, right? But what skills will actually fill those gaps of the time that's freed up for those employees. So this is about matching your work back, a plan, and then coming up with a work back plan to really address those skills. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Marshall Sied, co-founder of Ashling Partners, and Brandi Corbello, the VP of Transformation at Cushman Wakefield.
Oh, they put them up.
Hi everyone, I'm Marshall Sied with Ashling Partners, and it is my great and distinct honor and privilege to present and moderate this fireside chat with Brandi Corbello from Cushman Wakefield.
Thanks, Marshall.
In a moment, I'm going to ask Brandi to introduce herself and say a little bit about Cushman Wakefield. Before we do that, I wanted to provide a little structure in regards to the context of the conversation. This is really a three-part play, if you will. Act 1 is really about establishing the foundation for the automation program. Part 2 is really about scale and some of the challenges and friction you run into across people, process technology when you're looking to scale. And then really the tipping point is part 3. So a lot of recurring themes to what we heard from Bettina and Ron in their conversation. It's about the people and what we're doing to reskill and upskill. So it's a very inspirational story, hence being in the inspirational theater. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Brandi for introductions.
Yeah, my name's Brandi Corbello. I'm a VP of Transformation at Cushman Wakefield. We've been along this journey with Ashling Partners the whole time, so it's been really cool to kind of see automation playing. But now we're at this tipping point, right? We have this foundation of automation, and now we're really looking at our workforce and the organizational change that it's going to drive. So it's exciting.
Absolutely. Brandi, can you say a little bit about Cushman Wakefield for those that might not be aware?
Yeah, sure. So Cushman Wakefield is about an $8 billion commercial real estate company. I'm sure you can imagine super old school, stuck in their ways. So we've been along the journey, but they've allowed us to innovate, which is really exciting.
Absolutely. No, appreciate it, Brandi. So maybe jumping into part 1 of this discussion, there's not a lot of structure, just an FYI, but we did want to provide some structure here. Knowing what you're dealing with from a historical trend perspective at Cushman Wakefield, to your point, a very storied but traditional organization, so impacting the workforce using automation is not a small task. And we're firm believers that you're not a product of your environment, but you're a product of your expectations. So one of the things that I thought was very inspiring was how you set expectations up front. I wanted to talk a little bit through how you did that kind of in phase 1 to establish the organization for the automation program and really set yourself up for scale. Yeah. So number 1, you did this through Art of the Possible. Can you talk a little bit about how you were able to engage?
Yeah, and before we get there, I think it's actually important for this group to know we started in February of 2019 with a proof of concept, and our first automation actually did not go into production until January of 2020. So it's really important because we spent a lot of time establishing governance and how we were going to work. But back to the point of Art of the Possible, we spent some time with one of our business units, very transactional type business unit, but it is revenue generating. So we spent some time with them. They had a problem statement, right? They needed higher margins. Mm-hmm. A couple years prior to us coming in, they had tried offshoring this group and it didn't really go well. So we basically said, give us a month, we'll show you what automation can do. So long 30 days, Matt Garofoli remembers this, 20 hours a day for 30 days. We came back to them and we showed them automation could do what offshore could do, right? So you could basically leapfrog offshoring these roles. So they signed up for a business case that would really bring back about 100,000 hours back to their business. Now what's important here is this leader is really well respected in our organization, and it's a revenue generating role even though it's transactional. So once we showed that, she got really excited and started talking to her peers.
No, that's fascinating, and it was very powerful. We were there for that, and that was very powerful to see. I think one of the areas that I think was very positive that led from that was the fact that it wasn't departmental, though, right? You use that to go across the organization to build awareness and consensus. Now, was it perfect consensus? Probably not. There is no such thing, but to build consensus across the enterprise and not to keep it departmental and siloed. Can you talk a little bit about how that kind of took into effect?
Yeah, as I mentioned, this leader is pretty vocal and well respected in our organization. So she was screaming pretty loudly about how great this automation thing was. So what that really sparked was our executive team and our board asking us, where else could you do this? Us being new to commercial real estate, because I have zero commercial real estate experience, it allowed us to actually spend time with all of our leaders, functional and business leaders, to understand their business. So we really started tapping into what are the problems you're facing, how can we help you, where can automation play a role? So we were able to establish, I would say, 6 to 8 strategic programs across the organization rather than it being siloed, which meant we would run this thing in parallel, right? And I think a lot of times what you see in COEs or within organizations that invest in automation, they really start in finance. And they stay in finance for a year or two. We established it so we could kind of go across the business and our functions.
So I guess one of the areas is value capture, right?
Yeah.
In order to do some of the cool things that you're doing within the workforce and across intelligent automation, not just RPA, it was because it was a value-driven program from day one.
Right.
Can you talk about the capture of that value across those 6 to 8 units?
Yeah, so when we spend our time with all these business leaders, it allowed us to understand what makes them tick and what really brings value to their business, right? Or what their true problem statements were. So we really focused in on those problem statements and showed, like, here's where automation can add value. Here's how you can think about your business differently, which was really important on the onset. And we'll get into this, but we continue to always come back to the value that it's creating for our business partners.
Absolutely. So I want to come back to a point you made earlier here. So kind of shifting forward into the next step here on infrastructure. You mentioned 6 months, 8 months it took on the first automation. A lot of people in the audience are probably saying that's not what automation's about. It's supposed to be a lot quicker and more agile and iterative.
Yep.
But there was a lot of foundational level setting that you guys had to get in place from an infrastructure perspective, from a governance structure perspective, from how you dealt with CAB, as an example, to ensure that that wasn't going to be a bottleneck downstream once you actually got scale and had some more velocity. You talk a little bit about some of the key levers you pulled to establish that infrastructure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I talk to a lot of my peers, and as they establish their teams, they're really looking at the technical part of automation, right? And standing up their team to be technically savvy in what this can do. We didn't really take that approach. We actually took a business-led approach. So most of the folks on my team are former consultants, right? Process consultants, business transformation folks, not really technical. So it was really important for us to ensure that they could align with business partnerships, because as I mentioned, we had 6 to 8 strategic programs that were very business value led. So we brought them in to really partner with all of these leaders. So that was number one. And then second was, we knew we weren't going to be delivering from a technology standpoint, like we're not going to be hands on keyboards, right? So we really spent time on who's going to be our delivery partner and how are they going to work with our team, right? How are they going to be an extension of our team, not just a consultant doing work, right? So that was really important. And then lastly, standing up the infrastructure for scale was really important because we saw the demand, right? And if we weren't ready on the onset, they would have given up on us, right? Because it's a new group and an old school company, they needed to trust us from the beginning. So we really made sure infrastructure was stood up, spent time with our technology team to understand what's your governance process, right? How do we ensure that we're putting things in production that we should be, or what we shouldn't be doing?
Yeah, we're going to come back to that point in Act 2 of this play for sure. So at that point, you're putting things into production, right? Kind of is probably a segue to Act 2 here, but any kind of common challenges you had at the onset here?
I think it was important for us to deliver our first automation and it to be a success, right? So we spent a lot of time on our first automation. We probably tested it way too much because we did not want to put this thing in production and not to run. So it was really important that we delivered production grade automation at the beginning.
So kind of shifting here. So you've basically, to summarize kind of Act 1 here, you have built consensus and awareness, you have ROI attached, you've got infrastructure in place, you've got governance and standards from a process perspective, from a COE in place.
Yeah.
You're ready to run now.
Yeah.
And sometimes tactics are the most strategic thing we can do, tactical execution. So kind of going into this next stage of this conversation, we're going to talk a little bit about tactics, what were viewed as tactics at the time, but actually ended up being extremely strategic for the program.
Yeah.
So you're in production.
Yeah. Our first automation, we were talking about this. Our first automation went into production. I remember I was like, oh shit.
Yes.
What do we do now? Because like now, like it's working. We saw the first one work. Now we've really got to start this like snowball effect, right? Because we've got a lot of demand. We have strategic programs. Leaders have signed up for this. So what was really important for us was to ensure we kept our house in order while we were continuing to expand. And what that means is as automations were going in production, we needed to make sure like we kept focus, right? So anything that's in production, we can keep the lights on, but we were able to maintain focus on expanding the program and putting new automations in production.
Absolutely. So when you were doing that, and we witnessed this some, everybody was happy, right?
Yeah.
Everybody was great. We're getting 5 to 10% back from a business user process ownership perspective. Not quite at that tipping point that is the headline of this conversation, right?
Yeah.
But can you talk a little bit about that phase of the program?
Yeah, before I get to like end users feeling good about what we've done so far, what was really important to actually capture value, and I see this kind of as a miss sometimes when I talk to other folks, automations can run and they can be successful, but that doesn't mean you've captured value, right? Because the end users could still be performing that same process in parallel manual, right? Because they haven't quite trusted it or adopted that automation. So early on, we actually prioritized adoption and change management. We actually have a change management team that's an extension of my team, right? And really that is to ensure the end users are adopting automation, right? Because at the end of the day, if they're not accepting it and they're not adopting it and they're not using it how they should be, the business hasn't actually captured value. So we did that early on, but to your point, like on the change management curve, typically like when you start relieving people a little bit, they're really happy. So when you get to a 5 to 10%, they're excited, right? They're like, this automation's cool. I can go to dinner with my family. This is gonna be great, right? I'm super excited.
Yeah, absolutely. But you really haven't fully kind of started to change their dichotomy of their jobs yet at that point, right?
Exactly.
Which kind of leads to this next piece. So the kind of inevitable snowball effect that you were referring to, Brandi, there was more demand at that point, right? Floodgates opened, and you guys already set up the front of the store and the back of the store, if you will, to ensure that you're balancing supply with demand, because if you can't fulfill that demand, people lose confidence. But if you don't have that demand kind of well vetted to value capture, then it's pointless. You can't measure any of this, right? So you had demand increase at that point. What changed in that next stage, though? Because once you kind of cross that chasm from 10% and above of tasks changing per role, things do change from a change management perspective.
Yeah, I would say, when we got to the 5 to 10% and like the SMEs, right, the people really like impacted were accepting the automation, the leaders were really coming back for more or asking like, how can you do this faster, right? As I mentioned, they all signed up for these strategic programs and they wanted more, right? And they wanted it faster. So that really increased not just demand, but it really forced us to think about how we work, right? As a team for the organization and partnering in the organization. So at the beginning of this year, actually it was late last year, we started talking about moving to more of an agile approach to our delivery methodology. And we really started to shift towards that because that was really going to accelerate not just our delivery, right, for our business partners, but it's also going to accelerate value. I think what's also really important here is we were running waterfall, right? You saw this, and we were allowing perfection over progress. So all of our business users or end users were really wanting all or nothing, right? I think I've heard it on so many calls, like, I want my cake with everything on it, and it's like, no, that's not how this works, right? We're gonna give you like the minimal viable product, and then we'll figure out what's next. So that was a shift not just for our team, but for our business partners throughout the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a critical shift. I'm going to drill into Agile a little bit here because I think a lot of people in the automation space are either waterfall because you're dealing with process SMEs that are used to implementing ERP applications or CRM applications, or they're coming at it from an IT custom software development lifecycle perspective and it kind of needs to be in the middle. There needs to be a hybrid approach in Agile for automation programs.
Yeah.
What are some of like the tactics that ended up being strategic to our earlier comments around Agile? Like what were some of the things you did to bring service line leaders into the fold to get them to understand that, hey, UAT is not going to be the same way anymore, right?
I would say we're not quite there, right? Our industry's still old school, right? Nothing's changed there. But we are like, we continue to educate them. We continue to educate ourselves, right? So right now we're really defining like what's our workflow, right? And what's really like critical or needed in order for us to deliver. We did send some of our like more strategic business partners through like product owner training, right? And they did some Scrum training with us so they understand Agile. They did an Agile boot camp with us, but it's still like an iterative process just getting them on board. And I would agree, right? Like we won't shift entirely to like pure Agile. It doesn't really make sense for the automation space, but we're trying to find that good like hybrid, not just for us, but our business partners.
Yeah, it makes total sense. It's still an emerging space for sure.
Yeah.
So going into change management a little more. So 20 to 30% as a forecast.
Yeah. Yeah, this is really important. And before I get there, I'm going to talk about the maturity curve of Agile. So I want to stay on this topic for a second. We actually started becoming stagnant. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this year, we went into Agile. We were like, let's do this thing, right? And we started doing it, and we were like, just trying things out, right? But what we found is we were becoming a little bit stagnant because the business was prioritizing. We were really putting enhancements ahead of net new automations because that's what the business could see, right? They were like, I know I want this enhancement in this process in production. I want it right now. Versus like taking the mindset of, I need more value, right? And I need to focus on net new automations as well as enhancements. So right now, my team is working through, and they're going to love this because it's been nonstop the last 2 months, but we're really working through like, what is our workflow, right? Like, how do we manage work? And anybody from UiPath, please cover your ears. Like, part of that is actually like stage gates, right? We have all these deliverables when we like deliver an automation, right? A PDD, an SDD, an OID, and we're really trying to figure out like, how do you knock those down, right? Because they kind of get in the way and they become a roadblock. So we've really started shifting away from that pure PDD document that I'm sure all of you are used to into like a Miro board that can be collaborative with our business partners, which is really important because for us, we realized that PDD was actually creating that perfection over progress mentality. So I think, you know, for anybody like on the maturity curve, like it's a continuous like evolution, right? And you just need to continue to check yourself and make sure like, is this working, right? Or how can we like shift how we deliver? But back to your point on the change management front, what we're finding at Cushman Wakefield is when you hit that 20 to 30% of time back to end users, that's when they feel it. So we've started to try to get ahead of that. So when we hit 5 to 10%, we've started talking about, well, what's next, right? Because if we don't get ahead of the 20 to 30% and it hits them one day, right, they're going to become fearful. They're going to be uncertain. And then you lose people. They really have that decline on the change management curve. So we've spent some time on, like, what does that mean? And this is really the tipping point for organizational change for those business units.
That is a perfect segue to the last part of this act. So basically, education is the way. Yeah. I think a lot of people understand that education can be galvanizing in a very positive way if you present it the right way, with the right context. So everybody knows that people that are focused on digital dexterity and upskilling and reskilling your current labor force are the ones that actually end up in the top 10% quartile for performance, regardless of your industry. That's pretty consistent across. So what we wanted to talk about next are some of those stats that you look at as a leader of the transformation automation program, and how you communicate this to folks that are thinking about the change of work that we're doing.
Yeah, it's really important. Bettina took my stats from yesterday, so she's still out there. I see you. No, but really, like Gartner, has put out there 85 million jobs will be supplanted by automation by 2025, but 97 million jobs will be created by this tech-driven economy that we're in right now. It's also important to know, like right now, as of September, there's about 11 million jobs in the US vacated, and we have about 8.5 million people unemployed. So like, what does that tell you, right? It tells you that we have a gap, right, inherently. Like, why can't 8.5 million people fill some of those 11 million roles, right? And And another part of this and why these stats are so important, or how we think about it, is today we're talking about 30% of tasks can be automated, but by 2025, 50% can be automated. So you think about that, like you're only amplifying the skills gap issue, right? And the important thing that we stay close to as well is, more than half of L&D executives are saying that the skills gaps is growing. And like we see that, right, with the numbers of unemployment, jobs going up, jobs vacated, and jobs being created. And it's been really important for us to think about our current talent pool and how we actually shift them into these skills of the future, right? And take advantage of them being a part of our organization already and investing that back into them.
I could not agree more. I think the question is the how at this point, right? So everybody wants change until it impacts them.
Yeah.
That is absolutely the scenario in corporate America right now. So let's talk about the how a little bit.
Yeah.
Skills ontology. What is it? Why is it important?
Yeah, so what we did, and we've done this with a pilot group, and we'll continue to actually do it with other groups in the organization that we work with, is we've said, here are the skills today of this group, right? If we had to make some hypotheses, here are the skills tomorrow. And that allows us to actually identify the gaps. Now, it's all like assumptions and hypotheses, but it allows us to actually see some of the gap at least. So what we've done is we've established that gap, and we've established like where the businesses want to go with their workforce of the future.
So now that you have the gap established, it's about having a plan to close the gap.
Yeah, exactly. So reskill, upskill, it's buzzwords these days. But we actually do spend some time with these end users, right? Like working through their gap, right? Like, or that skills gap, and ensuring they have a plan to start closing the gap. And I would say, I don't think anybody's gonna get 100% there, but if you like start like uplifting people, reskilling and upskilling them, you can at least start closing it with your current talent pool.
Absolutely. So maybe coming back to a stat before we jump forward. You mentioned 50% of tasks being automated. What happens when that's full end-to-end processes, right? How often are you coming back and looking at that skills gap? Because it's going to increase as technology capabilities increase.
Yeah.
And I think people that are doing just RPA today are maybe not looking at that skills gap that way, but you start infusing machine learning and AI and other aspects of the UiPath platform into that skills gap. You have to prune that analysis of that gap pretty frequently.
Yeah, I would say, and it's interesting before we even like move on, is it's probably like every 18 months we should be looking at this more often as leaders of organizations, especially with how quickly the economy is moving and the industry is moving. But as a part of this too, and what we've found is like the more we automate and the better the technology is getting, we're getting closer and closer to unstructured data, right? And that's really important because 80% of data is unstructured and it's been untapped for so long. So for us, we're actually thinking about like, what is the unstructured data that we want to start tapping, and what do we want to do with it, and how does it differentiate us? Because that's really where like you start having that catalyst for the future.
Yep, makes total sense. So moving forward, now that you have the gap established and you start to have a reskilling, upskilling plan, and you're doing that 12 to 18 months, however often you're iterating in regards to that gap, how do you enable and empower your people?
Yeah, this is really important, and it's going to come back to the citizen-led development thing we always talk about, right? It's coming, and I think it's important for us to have the right technology stacks for our people, and we're enabling and empowering them in the right way. But I think, the role of the COE in the future is really going to be like that connectedness and that governance, and really like the challenger of like, hey, you're getting closer to this unstructured data, like here's how you can think about using it or utilizing it, right? But they'll be able to see like really what they've enabled or empowered like on their own.
So the ultimate role of the COE.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what total workforce management means and working with your digital workforce?
Yeah,
Yep.
So I'm sure everybody's experiencing this right now, but we end up as a COE managing our bots, right? The performance of our bots, the operations of our bots. Our leaders are not, right? And we're actually getting to a place where leaders need to manage not just their people, but their digital workforce. Because in the past, like over the last 3 years, it was one or the other, right? It was a bot or a person. And we're actually getting to a place where they're most optimal together. And I think that's really where we have to, it's not just about the end users and their change, it's also about the leaders and their change and how they manage their entire workforce.
Yeah, I think those are all very valid points. I think human in the loop and just being aware that you're going to be working in a digital worker environment as well is very critical nowadays. So what's next in closing? What's next for Cushman? What's next for the program?
You know, I think we're going to continue to think about the people journey. Like I mentioned, the technology stack just keeps getting more sophisticated and it just keeps getting better. We're getting closer to unstructured data and tapping that. So really for us, it's to help our business leaders figure out what to do with that and how to differentiate themselves, but then also think about their talent pool and how they can fill those needs.
Well, it's been very exciting and an honor to be a part of the journey with you.
Thanks.
Really appreciate the insights.
It's been fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Brandi.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Look at that timing.
I know. I was looking